for giving us this brilliant chance. I hope everyone is pleased in the end with the time we spent together and with the discussions that we will have. I think, I think I'd like to briefly talk first about our experience as co-editors of the Routledge Handbook of Translation and Activism, and the concept of translational activism or activist translation we developed in the course of our dealing with more than 30 contributions from all around the world. So let's first begin with an overview of the state of the field, or the field of the studies, or the field of action, of course, because there is a theoretical side and there is a practical side to activism and translation, of course. In most general terms, we can imagine the field as an intersection of translation studies and social movement studies today, with, of course, overlapping tools and methodologies. From the vantage point of translation studies, the question is how the act of translation is reformulated or redefined for social and political activist purposes. And from the perspective of social movement studies, the question is how translators can contribute to activist projects. Then the questions are straightforward. How, where, when can translators be activists, and vice versa. In the course of our work in translation and activism, we became interested in thinking about the subject from the perspective of agency. In fact, we had received a good chapter from the translation theorist and linguist Cobus Murray, which led us to think about the question of agency more seriously. The title of the chapter, as you can see, is the Okiame Poma, Exploring the Multimodality of Translation in Pre-Colonial African Context. And as you can see, Murray, this is just to give you an overview of the chapter, presents data from West Africa regarding the notion of the linguist and the linguist staff, or Okiame Poma, to present an argument regarding pre-colonial translation practices. So the Okiame is an official in the Royal Court of the Akan, entrusted with a wide variety of communicative tasks that relate to the royal house and the politics and its communication with this Okiame works as some kind of a mediator between the royal court and the people. So it is a very official political status that the Okiame or the linguist enjoys in that Akan tribes. So the question was, what constitutes exactly the activist content of the activities of a mediator between the sovereign and the people? I mean, the activist content of the activities of someone who serves and justifies the powerful ruler rather than the people. The Okiame or the linguist, as I told you, mediates the communication of sovereign's orders and people's complaints or messages. So our question was, what is activist in this courtly service? Why should this chapter be included in our volume? If the Okiame is considered an activist, is he aware of it or not? Because we were thinking that we had this question, shouldn't activist roles be assumed consciously. So this assuming consciously a responsibility, not to take it, is a matter of agency. And apparently the linguist in the Aachen Royal Court lacked such disposition. I mean, some conscious and voluntary desire to contribute to an activist project. We also confronted other situations, other considerations about the matter of agency, which made it very important to us in the context of translational activism. For example, there were some texts, for example, which were not originally written with some kind of activist cause in their own time and place. But in some contexts, they were used as activist drives. We noticed either the contribution of a translation in social changes was assessed based on the original text as a, for example, we can assume that translating Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto is such a kind of activist translation in which the original text is explicitly an activist treatise. But on the other hand, we were receiving, for example, contributions about texts which were not originally activist, but in other times and in other contexts, they were used for activist cause. For example, Kuan Yin Liu's chapter, Late King Translation and the Political Activism of Chinese Revolutionism. It was very interesting because Kuan Yin Liu showed how he regards the late 19th century Chinese translations of Darwin's evolutionary science as part of an activist or politically reformist program. So it was in this way that our question changed to what constitutes the activism of a translation. So we decided to examine the problem from a translation studies perspective. And we started from the classical problem of translation studies, which is fidelity and infidelity, the very famous Italian proverb of traduttore, traditore, the translator is a betrayal. This has always been at a stake in translation studies and has found a variety of reformulations since antiquity, from the classical, Saint Jerome's word for word or sense for sense modeling of translations to Venuti's more recent categorization of hermeneutic and instrumentalist translation modalities. So translation in general is a discourse of fidelity. One of the factors that distinguishes two translations of the same text can be the translator's fidelity to different aspects of a text, while for some translators, a strict adherence to the form of the work they are translating characterizes their task. For others, it is the ultimate meaning that should be conveyed perfectly. So this is a natural consideration in any act of translation across two languages, because we know not all aspects of an original text can be reflected in translation. So different translators have different ideas about what should be preserved in their translation and what should go. So in this way, the translator also works as a strategist, as a decision maker, and this decisions that he makes are more related to, for example, what changes he brings to the text. But it is not the text. I mean, the agency of a translator should not be assessed based on the changes he makes to the original text, because it was with the cultural turn of the 1990s that this idea of fidelity was radically challenged. Most importantly, in the work of André Lefebvre, who showed that even the most strictly faithful translations are not immune to interference and manipulation imposed by the translator's ideology. So his theory of translation as rewriting is centered around the idea that translation is always interventionist, and translator's agency is defined by to what extent the change that occurs during a translation process happens consciously or unconsciously. So the classical model of agency considers the interventions of a translator, interventions with respect to the text, while this model is modified in activist approaches to translation, because this is an they usually consider this interventionism from the perspective of the interventions that are made to the context, not to the text. So let me put it simply. An activist translation manipulates not only the text, but also the context. The activist translation is considered activist not in terms of the changes it makes to the text, which is universal with any kind of translation, but in terms of the changes it makes to the context. I mean, its contribution to the social change, to a reformist or a revolutionary agenda. So there are two decisive moments in the development of activist translation studies, as you can see here. It is Maria Timoshko's article in 2000, Translation and Political Engagement, and Mona Baker, 2006, Translation and Activism, Emerging Patterns in a Narrative Community. Both Baker and Timoshko discuss activist translation in terms of this intervention in the context. For Timoshko, activist translation works like a speech act and has to be assessed with respect to its impact on the society at large. An activist translation has to move people, has to mobilize, and the question that Timoshko puts forward is, what's the point of rendering a translation which is strictly faithful to the original, but incapable of affecting the mind, which is the motivation for a political mobilization? This was important. Baker uses a narrative theory to show the mechanisms of the contribution of activist translators to social change. It means that she shows how activist translation interfere with existing power structures by challenging their grand narratives, by producing alternative narratives or proposing new paradigms for resistance. But for both Timoshko and Baker, activist translation is always a matter of partiality and taking side. So I just forgot to turn the slides. So because of this contextual dependency of activist translation, Rebecca and I became interested in temporal structures implied in the context of activist translation. So we were interested in how a translator is able to activate the potentials of a certain text across time. The potentials to change, I mean, activism always happens at a time of now. For a social movement to be successful, a good sense of timing is always necessary. So this is the temporal aspect of an activist translation. An activist translation is necessary in certain times, can reveal its revolutionary or changing potentials in certain moments. And this timing, this sense of timing, does not merely refer to the chronological actions that should be taken during a protest movement, for example. Rather, I refer to a chirological aspect of the social movement or an activist campaign. Kairos, in contrast to chronos, refers to time as opportune moment, as a moment that should be seized. And this is very nicely put in this quotation from Walter Benjamin's Thesis 8 on the concept of history. The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception, but the rule. We must attain to a conception of history that is in keeping with this insight. Then we shall clearly realize that it is our task to bring about a real state of emergency, and this is what an activist translation does. It brings about a real state of emergency, and this will improve our position in the struggle against fascism to the end. Okay, so okay, there is another thesis. I think that it is also very good if I can read from thesis 15, which is very much relevant to this idea of time and its relation to time of the now, and its relation to the activist translation. It says that the awareness that they are about to make the continuum of history explode is characteristic of the revolutionary classes at the moment of their action. The Great Revolution introduced a new calendar. The initial day of the calendar serves as a historical time-lapse camera, and basically it is the same day that keeps recurring in the guise of holidays, which are days of remembrance. And then it gives a very good example of this chirological aspect of time. It says, in the July Revolution, an incident occurred which showed this consciousness is still alive. On the first evening of fighting, it turned out that the clocks in towers were being fired on simultaneously and independently from several places in Paris. So I'm going to finish very shortly. As an example, just imagine that when a translator like the Iranian writer Ali Shariati, who translated Franz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth into Persian for the revolutionary atmosphere of 1970s era. This translation ties the experience of colonialism in Algeria to the political oppression under political system in Iran, who was believed to be an accomplice to colonial superpowers. So 1960s Algeria is translated into 1970s Iran. And this is the comparative aspect of activist translation. I tend to call it the metonymic function of activist translation. That is, activist translation reconfigures history through creating metonymic associations across different times and situation. That is why Rebecca and I decided to translate the Iranian philosopher Morad Farhadpour's text named Thought and Translation for Routledge Handbook of Translation and Activism, because it contained a lot of good insights on how activist translation should be characterized based on the situation to which it serves. Yeah, I think that was an overview of the field of the studies of activist translation and what we tried to highlight in our co-edited volume.